Welcome everybody. Welcome to the final event in our Festival of Northwest Thinking, the fourth one. I'm very proud to have two Metro Mayors, Andy Burnham and Steve Rotheram, here today to questions and talk about the sector's role in building back better over the next, hopefully soon, months and years. If people would introduce yourselves in the chat boxes, that'd be great. Thank you for coming and making it today. If we could stay on mute unless agreed in advance. So if you've got a question, then you can come off mute. But if people would keep on mute, we've got a lot of people here, so it'd be useful to keep it that way if we can. If you introduce yourselves in chat, as I say, please note we're recording the event and the footage will be used as a follow-up. So if you're not comfortable with being seen, it should switch towards people who are speaking. If you're not comfortable, then please turn off your video camera. I think we all know it's been a tricky year, to say the least. Hopefully, we're now at a turning point. And if anybody knows who the name of the second person to get vaccinated yesterday in Coventry is, I think it's a good start of a 10 on hopefully one day returning to pub quizzes. So if you stick your answer in the chat box, that would be good. And I'll reveal the answer at the end if you haven't got it. I'd say we're at a fundamental turning point in where we are. We asked government way back in April for, if people would mute, sorry, way back in April for, I think it was £4.3 billion investment to help rescue us during that period of time over Q1. We received 750 million, and as yet that still hasn't been distributed. I think it's an important thing to note that some public sector partners from both parties think that in some ways we have been bailed out by that funding, but as I'm sure you all know, it's barely touched the sides. In the previous events building up to this, we looked at structural racial inequality and how we as a sector need to look at that. So we'll be picking up on those strands of activity we need to pick up after this final event. In the second event, we looked at the role of infrastructure organisations, in particular in relation to COVID. I think we definitely need to ask for a more resilient system that can respond in a longer term fashion for any future emergencies once this one's out of the way. And that was a key marker in that second event. At the last event, which was our AGM and our kind of keynote event, we looked at the future of the sector and we heard from some really interesting think tanks and from funders. And I think the key line there was about questioning old economic ideas and thinking through what the world needs to look like going forward. So hopefully we can kind of begin the beginning of the next phase of what 2021 and the Northwest can look like. It's been really pleasing to see. It looks like we're going to revive the Northwest Leaders Board and think through how we use that as a vehicle to make the case to national government. We've relied on people like Steve and Andy to make the case for the North and for the Northwest, and they've been at the forefront of that. And I think if we'd known how valuable the Metro Mayor role was going to be in that single way, if nothing else, then it would have been, it's been something that those two people have made happen, and it's been really appreciated, I think. So today's agenda, we've got 5 minutes each from Steve and then Andy on the sector's vision, on their vision for building back better with the sector as part of that. And then we've cherry-picked a number of people for some questions. We've tried to get a balance of geography, gender, and issue across the piece, and we'll try and get through as many of those questions as possible, and I'll be attempting to call time on the answers from each of our Metro Mayors. So I'll stop talking because we're running late already, and if we could ask Steve Rotheram to begin and open up the event, and please put chat in the box and we'll try and respond and hear back his vision on building back better with the sector. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Chair. And I'll take you back in time to June when we were just getting over the first wave, and myself and Andy Burnham's attention turned to what happens next. And it was around, of course, rescue and recovery. So we put something together which was Build Back Better. subsequently stolen by Boris Johnson, which upsets us, but not so much that Joe Biden also used it over in the American elections, but we will allow him to do that. And that was because we'd identified that we needed to do something in our individual areas, really, to ensure that we could perhaps approach it slightly differently or completely differently in some cases to what a national government would do on our behalf. So devolution afforded us the opportunity to think differently. And when I first walked into the job, because Warren's mentioned about the sort of Metro Mayor role, when I walked into the job, one of the first things I did is to identify that there was a gap in the organisation, which meant that I could bring in mayoral advisors. And one of the first people that I brought in was Reverend Canon Dr. Ellen Loudon, who many people will know, wonderful person, but she is my mayoral advisor on the voluntary and community sector. And she also chairs something called FASJAB, the Fairness Associate Justice Advisory Board. And those two things really give a focus to what we need to do about engagement with the voluntary community sector. She keeps me abreast of all the developments. And during the height of the pandemic, one of the things that was brought to us was that we needed to respond nimbly to the unfolding crisis. So we created LCR Cares, which was a charitable pot that raised £2 million in just 6 months. And we were able then to support over 300 community groups that were doing stuff on the ground. So, people who were knocking on doors and helping in their communities. And they supported isolated elderly people, helped in the Black and minority ethnic communities, delivered food. There was stuff around online classes. There were domestic abuse charities, and we saw that there was an increase in instances of domestic abuse during the lockdown, but many, many more. And I'm really proud that we were able to do that and that we responded so quickly. But also, we were aware that the social economy is intertwined with the voluntary community sector. So we created a fund to support organisations within it, and it's called Kindred. And it was about our region's social businesses who are underappreciated, on many occasions, and they are drivers of the economy. So we wanted to do something with them. And of course, then we look towards building from the bottom up, and we're a combined authority that's embraced community wealth building and genuine inclusive growth. And I've not even scratched the surface, but I'll leave it at that with, just 4 minutes gone, because hopefully we'll pick up some of the other things that we're doing in the questions.
Steve, over to Andy. You speak.
Thanks, Warren. Afternoon, everybody. I think we would both say, we are so lucky in the jobs that we do just to have the vibrant voluntary sector that we have, both in Greater Manchester and the Liverpool City region. The calls we've made upon you in the last few years have been massive. We know that, but you've always been there. And I think it's just really important to start by saying that, we are both in your debt, and we really value our relationship with you. I think what we've all seen this year is that COVID has brutally exposed the inequalities in our society. I mean, they're always there, of course, and obviously the organisations on this call see them pretty much every day, but I think they've been laid bare in a way they've never been sort of shown before. And Build Back Better's got to start there, hasn't it? In terms of challenging that, the fact that some people's lives in this country are so insecure, their housing is so poor that it just doesn't allow them to protect their own health. I was on a call today where a journalist from London said, "Oh, well, it's because you've all been breaking the rules up there, isn't it, that the virus has taken such a hold?" And, there's a job to be done to kind of explain how unequal this country is, how some people are living their lives, and how levelling up has to start there in homes with people, in communities, never mind infrastructure that's big railway lines in 30 years' time. Levelling up starts there. For anyone who saw Burnley on the 10 o'clock news last week, I don't know if you did, but you should look it up, because that is the reality of life for many people in the Northwest, and it's grinding poverty, and it's got worse this year. And I think we just have to start there and build up from that, and build you up so that we can all tackle this together. Just to address the question, Warren, in terms of what we can do to build back better. So part of it is doing some of the things we've done this year. Steve and I, as you've probably seen, have worked together all year. And I think what's come through is when we do work like that, because we are great friends, as you all know, but if we carry on giving out that strong Northwest voice, I think that is part of building back better. You saw that I had my own disagreements with the Prime Minister. Well, perhaps it's because they thought that they could push the North of England around and tell it what was going to happen. But actually, that can't happen anymore if we're to address these inequalities. Steve and I think, need to keep working in the way that we're doing, with more voices joining us. And then that takes me to the second thing, Warren. Levelling up can't be done top down by promises of infrastructure or whatever it might be. It's got to be done bottom up. And actually, I think we all need to make a call for more devolution, more power for us to decide here what we want to do. And I just paint a kind of picture for you of how we might have had an alternative 2020. Imagine if back in February, March, the government had decided to localise instead of centralise and privatise. Imagine if the budgets for NHS test and trace and the support that was provided to people who were shielding and all kinds of other national funding had come to us. We would have done exactly what Steve is saying. We would have put it through you. We would have done that community wealth building, because we know investment in your organisations pays back many, many, many times. And this is a point I think that everyone needs to focus on. When everything is done top down by national government, the tendency is for them to go to those big corporate entities and sign off all of these billions of pounds. The more devolution you have, I think the more you will get pushed through the voluntary sector, because we absolutely understand your value to our city regions and the contribution that is made. So let's all of us make that call for devolution. And then finally, Warren, just to kind of throw in a thought, perhaps we all need to get better at how we work together as well. When I came in as mayor, I said I wanted a concordat with the voluntary and community sector, to recognise the fact that this is an equal partner in terms of the delivery of support to communities, and we need to treat the voluntary sector differently rather than just giving annual contracts, always forcing people through the hoops. Give people long-term core funding so that they can contribute back. I just look at what we've built around homelessness in Greater Manchester, where rather than sometimes the competitive way in which the system is forced to work because of the bidding that public bodies put forward, sometimes if we kind of align ourselves differently around a common goal, then we make more progress. So on homelessness in Greater Manchester, I think we've created something amazing, actually, where all of the sector is pulling in the same direction, supporting each other, because the problem is bigger than any of us individually. And maybe that's how we need to work going forward. In this most difficult of years, we raised the bar in terms of what we were doing on homelessness. We said we could give everybody a single room, and with that single room comes dignity, comes the ability to turn a life around. And the voluntary organisations here in Greater Manchester have been amazing, supporting people in that accommodation throughout the first lockdown and throughout the rest of this year. So if we can do it in this year, of all years, if we can work differently and work better together, then surely we can do that coming out of this pandemic, when we come to the other problems of food poverty, digital inclusion, you name it. I think we can get better through devolution at how Steve and I work with you, pulling everybody together, working together to achieve common goals. And yes, as much as we can, getting public investment flowing through your organisation so that we can both support you to deliver, but also support your organisation. So Build Back Better to me means all of those things. But I guess just finally, it means to me, and Steve and I feel very strongly about this, it means better pay for the people in the Northwest, at least a real living wage. It means no more insecure employment. It means a commitment to much better housing for people than the poor quality housing that has led to the spread of this virus. Maybe it even means a universal basic income for people. Build Back Better starts with people, not with infrastructure, is going to be my message going forward. And I know that we've got your support in making that case. So thank you, Warren. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you both. Our first question is from David Allen. So if he would unmute himself, tell us where he's from and ask his question. And this question is to Andy. And if Andy wants to pass over to Steve before the 5 minutes are up, that's fine as well, if we get a chance that way. We'll test this and see if this works. Dave.
Thanks, Warren. Yep, I'm here.
Hi, Dave.
Hi, Andy. Good to see you again.
And you.
So I'm working up in Cumbria for the CVS now, and we've been involved in the COVID response. And as you said, it's led by a lot of voluntary organisations, and we're just a part player in it. My question is, how can we maximise the benefits that have come from this positive recognition of the role that the sector's had in response and recovery?
I think, Dave, through more devolution, as I was trying to say in my opening remarks, the more that we are able to do for ourselves, the more that we will use you, not use you, but you know what I mean, work with you. And I think that's a natural thing that is done when you're kind of making policy at the level that Steve and I make policy, as opposed to the level of people in government departments. You know, they're looking out at the country with telescopes and they can't see what's happening on the ground. Whereas in our roles, we are on the ground. We know you, all of you. We trust you. And that, I think, builds a much better kind of working relationship when it's a place-based approach, as opposed to the policy silos of Whitehall. And I just think, you know, devolution is the thing that will kind of change the way we think and the way we work. And what I would say in Greater Manchester, increasingly, it will build a place-based approach to things, a person-centered approach. And if you go in that direction and you're thinking more about prevention, it's just a complete logical next step that you would route so much more through the voluntary sector. I mean, all of our councils, all 10 of them, say that the community hubs actually kind of brought to the fore a slightly different way of working, less bureaucratic, a bit more simple, informal. And I think maybe councils have seen that this year, and that might point the way to a kind of different way of them thinking. A number of our councils have said that they might keep some of the community hubs that have been created and kind of keep some of that informal way of working to provide support. So I do think, though it's been tough, this year will bring change for the better. And you know, as we look to the kind of the next year and beyond, I think we've got to be honest with ourselves and say it isn't going to be. It's like the vaccines here; it's all going to be easy, but it isn't, is it? I don't think we've really seen the full extent of the damage yet of what's been done this year. A figure was presented to me earlier today that I'll share with you that, to be honest, is going to be kind of haunting me really for the next few weeks. In a survey of residents, and when people were asked if they had any mental health concerns, 55% of respondents said they did. And I just thought, you know, when you think about that and you think about the damage that's been stored up this year that isn't going to be felt yet for some time, I just think the challenge before us is, as I say, is bigger than any of us, and we're going to have to work creatively differently to rise to some of what needs to be done in our communities in 2021 and beyond. Building Back Better, the problem with it's like a slightly glibbish phrase that sort of slightly rolls off the tongue. The truth of the matter is it's going to be one hell of a task, I think, to build back at all. And better might come in time, but you know, we're going to have a really big job on our hands next year, I think.
Do you want to come in there, Steve, for the final 90 seconds?
Yeah, just to add to obviously what Andy said, but I think we need specifically to lobby and hopefully to get a voluntary community faith and social enterprises sector resilience and capacity fund. So I know that that's a bit of a mouthful, but that provides at least the opportunity to look at cross-sectorally investments, so we can develop the long-term capacity of the voluntary and community sector and others in our individual areas. And that's the way that you can help organisations. Because just to end on this point, the question was about the positive response to what has had to happen because of COVID. Actually, whilst there's been a more recognition of what different sectors, such as key workers, for instance, and the NHS have done, that's not been borne out by the government rewarding people both with the pay increase, but also through some of the funding streams, so that we really can start to build up those capacity issues in our areas. Because obviously what we will need the same sectors that we've used previously in the years ahead.
Thank you, Steve. Our second question is from Wyn Lawler. If you want to unmute, Wyn, and then introduce yourself.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm Wyn Lawler. I work for Irish Community Care, which is an organisation across the Northwest working with Irish traveller, Gypsy traveller communities. And I'm also a trustee at Liverpool and Sefton YMCA. So, and as you can imagine, us in the third sector, we're really, really good at getting value for money. So there's three parts to this question that I'm about to ask. How can we ensure the inclusion of our most excluded communities going forward? What do we feel we can do differently as a region to make this happen? And where does the voluntary sector fit in this plan, please?
Thank you, Wyn. It's to you first, Steve.
Hopefully, Wyn, I'll do justice to the three parts of the question, and I'll try and take them in three bits. But just a general overview is that we absolutely recognise the need to do more for those communities that have been left behind. Look, if one thing has happened over this period that's made us all think, surely it's Black Lives Matter and all of the good stuff that's happened as a result of something awful somewhere else. And that should not just be around Black Lives Matter now. It should be about how can we level the playing field so that those communities that haven't had a fair crack of the whip, how do we get them involved in stuff? And the way to do that is actually through the voluntary and community sector, who have those links and have people who go out and do it. Because we can talk about policy and what we'll do on policy, but it's about engagements as well. So on the policy side of things, we're trying to look at using our funding, and I just have to put the caveat on that it's limited funding. You know, it's a stick and plaster, like the voluntary and community sector itself and what they do. They need more to do better things, and we need more that will enable us to do better things. But look, we've got some. So I've got a review now of all things in regard to unconscious bias and stuff that we'll do around structural discrimination in both the place that I am the head of as the Metro Mayor. I'm talking about the actual building itself, but also in the way that we distribute funding. So we've got a detailed review of that. And what I'm hoping from that is that we can demonstrate, because you mentioned value for money, that doing the things differently, you can get better value for money. And certainly including more of the excluded has to be part of that. So what can we do different in the region? Well, you don't have to do everything the way a government would distribute funding. You can look at procuring differently, and through CLES, and we're working with them in our area, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to look at building stuff up from the bottom and trying to give people the opportunity to plug some of those gaps that a national government can't help. I've forgotten the third part of your question. Wyn, could you just repeat it? Sorry.
Yep, my phone's just switched itself off, but bear with me a second. The last bit is, and where does the voluntary sector, so Excluded communities, how can we do it differently as a region, and where does the voluntary sector sit in that plan, please?
Okay, well, I can definitely answer for both myself and Andy on that last one, but then I will hand it over to Andy. Very, very front and centre, because we've spoken about this, and I just said about the recognition that those organisations that work in the voluntary community sector have had. That shouldn't be, thanks very much for what you've done, and next time we have a bit of a crisis, can you come and help us out? That has to be now, that you're engaged fully at every stage of what we do, and our funding has to reflect that, and that's what I'm doing locally. I'm sure Andy's doing something similar, but I'll hand over to him.
Thanks, Steve. Andy?
Thanks. It's such an important question. So the reference point for me is the work we've done on homelessness. And I've kind of been out there and looked at how people who are marginalised for whatever reason, often statutory services just don't get close to getting to the heart of the problem. You know, they pass people from pillar to post and never actually come up with solutions. So to answer your question, how do we kind of change that, do it differently? We've been talking here as part of our work on homelessness through our homelessness programme board to look at a concept called inclusion health, which was not something I knew much about until this year. But we're now kind of looking at it quite seriously, which is designing health services for the most excluded or the most marginalised, and sort of work from there, because the theory is you will make services better for everybody if you make them as inclusive as possible from the outset. I think that when you say differently, it is to me about getting rid of the silo mentality in public services. I think that really holds us back, you know, kind of thinking about the person, the place, joining up around those things. That's what we're trying to do with our model of what we call unified public services in Greater Manchester. A single team around the person is what we need. And I guess then how does the voluntary sector fall in? Well, as an equal partner is what I would say, because the preventative side of things, or as Steve was saying, you know, the trust is often with the voluntary sector rather than with statutory services. So that kind of first kind of building of trust, building of the relationship should be often with voluntary sector partners who are then able to refer on. So, you know, that is the kind of way I would look at it. And I do, you know, and I do challenge this here in Greater Manchester. We've got to stop kind of the statutory sector has got to stop looking down its nose or looking, you know, kind of askance at the voluntary sector. It has to kind of see the value in the voluntary sector and work as an equal partner. And I think we've got some examples of where that is beginning to happen, but there's a lot further to go. I think Salford is a good example of a council and a borough that really kind of has the voluntary sector kind of really rooted in everything that it does. But I wouldn't say it's what we've got everywhere, and there's further work to be done on that.
Lovely, thank you, Andy. Question 3 is on commissioning and social value, and is if Darren Knight is there, would you step forward and introduce yourself and your organisation?
Hiya, thanks Warren. Hi Andy, hi Steve and everyone.
Hi Darren.
So I'm Darren Knight, I'm Chief Executive of George House Trust, HIV support organisation based in sunny Manchester, but we work across the region. My question is quite long, so Steve, intake of breath. As leaders, what will you do differently to ensure that the role and potential of the voluntary sector is both valued and, really importantly, understood among your political colleagues and those employed in strategy and commissioning within your organisation and local public sector partner organisations? End.
That's you first, Andy.
Oh, thanks, Darren. Well, I wouldn't say, hopefully I can point to what I've already done. So I don't know if you've been, Darren, I certainly some of your colleagues have, to our reform board. So Alex Winnan, who everyone will know, is and Chris, I think, is on the call. Chris Dabbs have been at the Greater Manchester Reform Board. Because when I was talking before about those unified public services, I've been really clear always with that reform board that this isn't just the public sector and the statutory sector having a conversation with itself. The voluntary sector needs to be at the table. Now, I know they would say, well, we're kind of like outnumbered at every meeting, but I have insisted that they're there at every single meeting. And we've had some fantastic discussions around support for the LGBT community with LGBT Foundation, Albert Kennedy Trust and others in the room. We've talked about homelessness with Mustard Tree and others in the room. And, you know, that I think is a symbol of the change that we need, basically, that the voluntary sector is always in the room and always part of the discussion. And actually what I always find is, you know, you do tell it as it is, and statutory services often have a way of talking that doesn't quite sometimes tell it as it is. And I just think you get better discussions, you get better policy making. And, you know, I've deliberately tried to sort of kind of do that lead from the front and having the voluntary sector always there to kind of basically say to our system, this should cascade right down the system to every single level. We have brought forward a Concordat, where we are talking about longer term funding, core funding. You know, treat them with respect, treat them as a long-term partner. Don't just treat them as a sort of a bidder for a funding that you kind of half distrust. And that's the kind of culture change that we're trying to build, Darren. I wouldn't say we're there yet, but I think we've made progress.
I've lost mute bingo, haven't I? Steve.
Yeah, I'll be brief just to fill the gaps again with what we're doing locally. I think how do we do things differently is the big question, and it'll be a recurring theme right the way throughout the evening, I would have thought, because that's the very reason for having devolution, to do things differently. So I'll give you an example of what we've done in the Liverpool City region, which is to tailor our response around the economic necessities, really, of engagement, because you have to demonstrate to government that you're spending money responsibly. So we've got our socially trading organisations and the whole sector, as I say, with the voluntary and community sector, is worth about £3 billion to us. And the result of that is to give ownership by the sector to manage and build capacity within the sector. So we offered social investment and peer-to-peer support for other community businesses with something called Kindred. Kindred's a £2 million programme that we've put together to try and develop the capacity, but also for people to develop those networks where people who are at the heart of their communities can speak to other people in the city region who might be doing similar stuff, to learn from those, but also, as I say, as a support network for them all. And it's obviously working very, very well, and it's being identified as being an exemplar of the way in which we can better engage and use funding from combined authorities, because local authorities can't do this.
Thank you, Steve. Our next question comes from Dan Wheatley. Do you want to unmute, Dan, and ask your question?
Afternoon, Andy and Steve. Thanks for your time. Dan Wheatley from the Prince's Trust. I work across both regions, so it's great to see what's going on in both GMCA and across the Liverpool City region. My question's already been touched on a bit by Andy. It's around the levelling up agenda. So I just wanted to ask if you expect to see any of that £4 billion budget that was announced in the spending review, and actually if that's going to sit with us in the devolved areas, or whether devolution's being diluted by central government, and what you expect to leverage from that and where you expect to take it.
I think absolutely. I think that's a really good question. Alongside that, we've got the question of the vision for devolution going forward. I know you have touched on it, Andy, but it'd be nice to hear a little bit more about that, because I think you've brought that back to the forefront, the two of you, and it's an important moment, I think. So it's with you first, Steve, this one.
Levelling up. I tell you how you don't level things up. you don't level things up by having a pot of money that everybody can access. You level things up by specifically targeting funding streams for those areas that are disproportionately disadvantaged. And I guess where that might be for the likes of me and Andy, that's Greater Manchester and Liverpool City region. So we would quite like to be levelled up and not levelled down, which is what's happening far too often at the moment. The £4 billion pot, 600 million of which is in the first year. So it's a jam tomorrow type pot. But that £600 million is open to everybody. And the way in which the caveat around MPs will be able to support projects in their areas was announced really sent a cold shiver down my spine. Basically, what we're saying is for marginal seats, red wall areas where there are Tories, what we'll do is we'll give you the opportunity to get a few bob from this pot so that you can prove that the government's listening and those borrowed votes might vote for us again. It's the wrong way around. What should have happened was they should have been strengthening devolution in areas and saying, these are pots of money, a single pot of money with flexibilities built in that you can spend that will bring people in your area up. So you bring communities, neighbourhoods and individuals upwards. And by doing that, you can then start to equalise the disparity across the whole country. And I'm afraid it was a massive missed opportunity. It's a political gimmick, and I think it will backfire, and there'll be all sorts of problems with the fund. Let's see how much of it is spent by this time next year.
Thanks, Steve. Andy.
Now, we speak, of course, Steve and I, as two recovering MPs. So we don't necessarily have it in for MPs, but can I just agree with what my good friend just said? This was a ribbon cutting fund. This is what this was about. This wasn't about levelling up. The way you level up, as Steve said, is if you go to the places that most need support. I'll come back to it. Look at Burnley on the news of a few nights ago. You go in with proper devolved funding in a place like that, and you don't tell them what will be delivered there, and you don't let the MP decide. You actually give local people agency to change things from the ground upwards. That's what you do. That's what levelling up would be. You would actually start to fund the councils properly in those areas so that they've got some agency as well. You would then fund the voluntary sector with the kind of devolved fund that Steve was talking about before. That is how you start levelling up. And you're absolutely right, it's Dan, wasn't it, to pick up on this. This levelling up in the way that it's now being defined by Westminster is anything but, to be honest. It's about dropping things out from their level that most communities don't even know that they wanted. I keep making this point, but it's an important one. If you look at the areas that went under local restrictions in the summer, Greater Manchester, parts of East Lancashire, parts of West Yorkshire, they were the original, that was the original footprint of the Housing Pathfinder scheme of the Labour government that I was a minister in. And that was a previous attempt to level up top down. And you know what? It didn't work. Because if you kind of, from on high, tell communities what they're going to get, it doesn't often meet with what they actually want. And there we are, Burnley is still sort of struggling like mad. Levelling up is about agency in the hands of local people, local areas, councils, devolved bodies like the ones we represent, the voluntary sector, and then you can start to improve people's circumstances in their day-to-day lives. And to call a £4 billion sort of slush fund, sort of levelling up fund, I'm afraid it just isn't going to happen. There was a £20 million limit on the projects, and basically what it will do is it will scatter sort of new sort of bus stations and train stations and roads across the country because there isn't any priority for any area, and it won't do anything, in my view, to level up.
Thank you. Do you think there's a way in which we can lobby for the right kind of investment needed going forward, or is the opportunity gone now?
No, I think we have to win the arguments, I think, Warren, about what is levelling up, because there are parts of the government that, you know, still can be persuaded, I think. You know, to be fair to them, the government did announce a devolved intra-city transport fund that Steve and I will benefit from at the spending review. So it wasn't all about that ribbon cutting fund. So they're kind of like doing contradictory things at the moment. But I do think after the big kind of disagreement I had with them, there was all these messages about, oh, we don't want any more devolution. But that's the time to fight more for it, because they want devolution, which is begging bowl devolution. Basically, they want to have all of the power, and that's why they create these bidding pots, because they've got the power and everyone is pleading for a little bit of that pot going on bended knee, and the ones who even go even lower on bended knee might be the ones who get the money out of the pot. That's how they do things. And then they divide me and Steve, divide and rule between Liverpool and Manchester. That's how they want to do things. And that is a factor of how, when they keep all the power, they will constantly then call the shots out everywhere. And that isn't levelling up. Levelling up will come when money is pushed out and devolved, where we decide with you and with local players what we're going to do with it. And I think we'll spend that money better when it's spent in that kind of way. Yes, we'll be held to account, but I absolutely assure you the voluntary sector would get more money and more support in an approach of that kind rather than in the Whitehall kind. So I think we've hit a really big moment. Sorry to just go off on one, but Warren, this is a moment, I think, for the English regions to demand devolution, because the Whitehall way of things has created this massively unequal country. And that has happened over centuries, where running the country from one postcode, SW1A, OAA, unsurprisingly, has led to a situation where some areas are treated more favourably than others. And these divides have been sort of built up over centuries. And when you hit a situation like this, a virus like this ruthlessly attacks those places that are the poorest. And there was a report this week that the Spanish flu 100 years ago attacked the north of England in exactly the same way that COVID has attacked the north of England. So nothing is changing, is it? And I honestly believe passionately, and we are two people who left Parliament because we could see all of its shortcomings. The time has come for people at local level to demand more agency to change things for ourselves. This current government promised levelling up. It promised a devolution white paper, and so far it hasn't put any meaningful definition behind that phrase levelling up. And we need to challenge them together with colleagues in business as well and say, no, you promised it. And we're going to define what this levelling up is and then demand that they deliver it. That's the way I see it.
Thank you. I think we see ourselves as very much aligned to that agenda and would be really keen to support that. I saw in the chat, I think it was Ben, talking about that common cause, and it feels like, you know, it's back to basics. It's back to how we support our communities and making the right asks together. I know we do across footprints, but I think we need to refresh that. Thank you, Andy.
Sorry, Warren, just to jump back in though, it goes back to the sort of stripping out of funding and powers from councils, doesn't it, a long time ago? I think you can trace a lot of this sort of imbalance to that as well. And, you know, I think levelling up does start with a properly funded local government base as well.
We're very proud that the Big Society Roadshow stopped at Stockport and made no further entrance into the northwest from there. Right, question 5 is Angela Allen. If you would unmute and introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, it's Angela Allen. I'm Chief Exec of Spring North, a consortium based in Blackburn but operating across Lancashire. I'm challenging Darren for the longest question on today's webinar. So, how can we persuade our public sector and LEP colleagues of the need to include the VCFSE sector as an equal partner in strategy, policy and planning, respecting our invaluable contribution to the local economy and wider well-being of the community, rather than merely including us as an add-on or philanthropic gesture?
If we focus on, I think one of the big gaps we've got some relationships, but we could do with fuller relationships, in particular with that economic agenda, couldn't we? But yeah, it's you first, Andy, on this one.
I'll defer to Steve, Warren, because I've been chatting.
Thank you.
Too much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Angela, I think what we've done in our city region is probably a start to addressing that. It's not the perfect solution, and I'm not kidding myself that we're getting everything right, but we are sitting people at the right tables so that they can take advantage of those funding streams and those opportunities. Whereas beforehand, not only weren't they at the table, they didn't even know whether there were any funding streams, and everybody was scrabbling around. Because as Andy's quite rightly said, beforehand they might have gone to local authorities, but local authorities have been hollowed out and they haven't got, you know, a penny to the names. So we're trying to open doors, and we're trying to get people to work collaboratively together. In our area, we've got something called the VS6, which is the voluntary and community sector, that's come together, and that's really helpful to me. And I'm sure Andy will have something, if not, he needs to, because I'm not trying to go, I'm really, really busy. It's not that. But at this moment in time, you can imagine all the calls on our time, and we couldn't possibly get out to all of the individual voluntary and community sector organisations or socially trading organisations or faith groups in our areas. So pulling together has been really helpful. And what that means is that there's a voice, there's a loud voice with Ellen Loudon, who fights the corner for those opportunities. And that's the way that you start to get it. And then it becomes normalised, that it's not an add-on or it's not a philanthropic gesture. It's something that people expect when talks are taking place or when programs are being developed, that as part of that, there will be consideration to the voluntary community sector.
Thank you. I'll move to question 6 because we're just pressing time. Chris Dabbs, you want to unmute yourself and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Warren. Hi, I'm Chris Dabbs. I'm Chief Executive of Unlimited Potential, which is a cooperative and social enterprise based in Salford. My question has 2 parts. What genuinely radical measure would you like to see implemented to address economic inequality but does not rely on central government? And what would be the role of the social economy within it?
That's to you, Steve, first.
Radical measures. I'm going to spin this one, because surely isn't that for you who are practitioners to come to us with radical measures and solutions and issues and ideas? Because I used to be Jeremy Corbyn's PPS, and he used to say, why do politicians believe that they're the repository of all the best ideas? And believe me, we're not. But probably you are, as the professionals in your particular sector. So please let me know if there are any radical measures that you think that we can take up in our area, because I believe that we've had a radical approach, but whether that's gone far enough, that'll be for you to determine. And what we can do certainly is to provide the platform for those ideas to be discussed, you know, to in a normal non-COVID world I'm talking about, but we can put events on, and we have done, and we've got those different groups from different areas sharing ideas, but also coming forward with proposals, which I think some of which have made their way into the development of the interventions from our funding that I've outlined earlier. And so it's a two-way street, really. But yeah, let me know. I've just seen one of the chat bar questions coming up saying about universal basic income. Is that radical? It is radical, but it's something I've already called for. I called for that in March, in the build-up to the lockdown. because I thought it would be important, given the enormity of what we were facing, that people would have a guaranteed income. And that's why I think it's the right thing to, well, I thought it was the right thing to do then, and I still believe it's the right thing to do. So much so that I've asked if the government is looking seriously at this. I've asked DWP to pilot it in our area. They haven't taken me up on that kind offer at the moment.
Thank you, Steve. I see Andy's disappeared already. He's arrived early and gone early. I think he's still there. The last question I was going to ask, because we've run out of time, but is there one thing from this conversation today, Steve, that stuck in your mind that would be useful to take forward as a kind of next step? Yeah,
that we're still not doing enough. But I knew that beforehand, but I'm looking at the chat bar, as I said, and I do believe that engagement is everything. Once you build relationships and trust, that goes an awful long way then of trying to get the radical ideas to be listened to at the right level. One thing that I think Andy's back now, one thing that Andy and I are really conscious of is that literally we could sit listening to people all day and ticking boxes, because that's what government do. They do it with us. We were on one earlier today, and I just felt, well, they probably said that they consulted with us now over something, and I didn't feel it was proper, meaningful engagement. But that's what we could do. I don't want to do that. I want to do something that will have some positive results. And as I say, I'm always willing to listen to people who come up with good ideas. And if there are any good ideas, we'll there's somebody on this call from my office, and we'll contact those people to see whether we can take anything forward. And he's gone again, by the way.
He has gone, hasn't he?
I'm sorry, Warren, I'm back now. But,
hello.
Yeah, sorry.
We were just looking for that kind of one last thing you'd like to take away from this conversation and put in place, as it were.
Oh, sorry about that. I was in, it was in hearing Steve in his flow, and he got cut off, and then I was gone.
Tell us your thoughts, Michelle. Oh, your name's changed now. Oh,
that was slick. That was slick. Right.
That was very slick. I mean, the thing that I was just thinking while I was trying to get back online was, in terms of the one thing that, it's this point we're making about how so much more would be better done, the more that power would be closer to people at a local level. And, I do go back to it, billions have been given to private entities to run, test, trace, isolate. For what? What is the value that's been left in communities as a result of that investment? There isn't any. And I think coming out of the pandemic, we need to sort of point to that and say, look, you ran it in this way during the pandemic, and it hasn't created any lasting benefit. Steve used a phrase before that I think we now need to really start to kind of own a bit, really, and kind of really think through: community wealth building. It's been hanging around a bit, hasn't it, as an idea. I think it needs to kind of come a bit to the fore now, because someone was saying before about, how do we get in the room with the LEP and the public bodies? I can't remember who it was. It was a question just before I left you all. I think, what they've done in Preston does need looking at. Anchor institutions in the public sector, good public-spirited private entities, but then with VCSE in the same room, and then thinking about commissioning for social value, with all of those players aligned, and trapping the money that they all use, not just public money, by the way, commissioning through private entities as well, through communities, and then keeping wealth in those places. And I think at the moment we're sending so much money as a country to places where it just makes no impact on people's lives. So I think, Steve used a phrase. I think, and Neil from Claire's has really kind of championed this. I think we need to get more serious about that, because if we had a proper community wealth building approach, I think the voluntary sector would be very much at the forefront with us then in building that wealth in people's homes and in communities and all the rest of it. So yeah, that would be my final takeaway, Warren, from today.
That sounds really good to me. That seems to square we've not used the term double devolution localism agenda that the theme seems to be coming through around how we do this in the right way. If we'd square that with a community wealth building piece, and I'm conscious we've got Wirral, Preston, Oldham, and we've got the experiments Alison's doing with her partners in Salford as well. We've got enough there. There'll be other parts of the Northwest and in Cumbria as well, I'm sure, that David's involved with, where we can pick up on this as a theme that I think the Northwest should be championing if the Northwest Leaderboard gets back together.
I think social value commissioning, Steve and I have talked about this, it's kind of been a bit hit and miss, isn't it? And it needs to become hit. We need to really drive it hard and become more specific about what we're wanting to achieve through social value commissioning. And that's a piece of work that we can both sort of champion.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your time this evening. It's been really appreciated. It's been fantastic and fascinating to listen to you and get a sense of the frustrations, the victories, the losses of your relationship with us, and thinking through. There seems to be no doubt to me about your commitment to the sector. We just need to put it on and make it more real and make it work better for our communities in the way we've just described. So thank you very much to both of you, and thanks for tonight. We will be sending out a monitoring form to people. I think if we could include in that your ideas as voluntary sector people for how we should be thinking through that community wealth building and what social value commissioning needs to look like as part of that evaluation of tonight's event, that would be really appreciated, and we'll look to feed that back in. I'm sorry we didn't get to Debbie's question, question 7. We'll send that on and see if we can get a response, if that helps, but no promises. And we'll be in touch with everybody around following on. Just a plug, Voluntary Sector Northwest membership is free. So if you're interested, we'll send a link to that as well. And thank you everybody for coming, and thank you for the people who've asked the questions, and for all the people who put in the effort and time to think through what they wanted to ask. It's been really a fantastic conversation. Thank you to Steve and thank you to Andy.